alphabetically, so you're not sitting up. But Catherine is the executive director of the North Carolina Center on Torture, which was recognized last night. And Catherine has a very distinguished background herself. You can read about 40 under 40, right, in terms of her prominence. And then last but not least, we have Scott Ream. Did I say it right? Ream, sorry, Scott. And Scott is also with the Center for Victims of Torture, and I believe in the Washington, D.C. office, who has a distinguished pedigree. So you can read about them in their program. So the first question I asked them, and I thought maybe Zainab and Catherine could speak to this first, and if anybody else wants to jump in, was in your experience, sort of going to the question of our dialogues, what kind of remedies or actions do the victims of atrocity crimes seek, and what do they need? And that was really the last question that was posed to Mahamadou, who said, nothing, I need to tell my story. But Zainab, how about you start us off? What do people want?
Thank you very much. I am going to focus my contribution on victims of sexual violence in conflict. From my experience in dealing with about 19 to 20 countries, I mean, talking to victims during my time at the UN, both in Liberia and New York and then in Sierra Leone, I think the first thing when you talk to victims or survivors, whatever you want to call them, the first thing they demand is justice for crimes that have been perpetrated against them. Therefore, legal remedies to address the prevailing impunity is one thing that they always ask for, is very critical. And I think this is very interesting and complicated because in a lot of the situations we work after conflict, the rule of law is non-existent, or the structures do not exist. If they do exist, they are very weak. Of course, the UN has done a lot of efforts. I'll come to it when we do the question and answers. And the effort we did when I was in the UN in supporting government to strengthen the national laws and to actually work on that. So I'll explain that later. The second issue, and President Santos, when he was interviewed recently after I left, they asked him, what did you learn in terms of dealing with the peace process? He said there is one lesson he learned, is to listen to the survivors. They want their story to be heard. And they want acknowledgments. There is such a strong culture of denial and a culture of silence in situations where there is mass sexual violence atrocities. And I remember when I went to Colombia for the first time, I had a group of survivors I sat with, and I said I was listening to them. About 10 of them, we had lunch in the restaurant. And as they were talking, telling me some of the stories, what happened to them, I was crying, and they were crying. I didn't say anything. I just listened to them. And after they finished, they all said, thank you so much for listening. You are the first person who actually sat down, didn't interrupt, and listened to us. He said, we're so appreciative. It's the same thing happened with the Yazidis. The first time I went to Iraq, and I met the Yazidis, and just because I gave them all the time they needed, I met their prince, I met their high priest, I met all their senior leadership, and I listened to them. I became friends of the Yazidi. I had to come now, and actually was the one who raised the alert and spoke about what was happening to the Yazidis. I was on BBC. I had a lot of challenges with a lot of the NGOs. They said, oh, you went to Syria, you only come to talk about the Yazidis. But because nobody knew what was happening to them, and all the atrocity, which later on I might talk, but that meant a lot to them. And they even said to me, you have become our mother. I became so friendly to their princes, to their high priests. I went into their temple. They took me everywhere because they wanted me to know what happened to them. And I think that's very, the acknowledgement. That's the second thing I think is very important to victims. The third is the guarantee of non-repetition. And I think this I learned with the Colombian crisis. I was very much involved in the Colombian peace process deal. And the Colombian civil society and the victims, they made sure the guarantor of non-repetition was actually included in the peace deal because they wanted to make sure it become part and parcel of the framework for the peace process. So they put it in the peace agreement. They said, we don't want this to happen to anybody more. We want to stop. We don't want any more atrocities. We have suffered, but we want our children to have peace. And so they insisted, everywhere we go, said, we want this to stop. And everybody said, we don't want it to be repeated. You have to see what you can do to help us to make sure it stops. So the non-repetition is the third. MSF and the others, the government's health services have collapsed. So if you go to a place like DRC, that's why Dr. Dennis Mukwege has become so important, because of the services he provides to those women. We had to take him to Guinea after the rape of the September in the stadium because he provided. So we worked with him to go to different countries to be able to see these women suffer in silence. The damage that rape caused to those women is unbelievable. They need to go under massive operation, it's not there. So lots of the women just want. I got that experience in Uganda where I met a lot of male victims who had been raped. Because then, initially, and then you become a victim second time. Yeah. So the medical provision of medical service, and a lot of time the medical service are underfunded in a lot of countries where you have huge victims of sexual violence. The fifth one is reparation and livelihood support. The thing about rape is that once you are raped, you abandon, you're ostracized. And in most countries in Africa, women don't have access to properties, don't have access to livelihood support. I went to Somalia where 75% of the women in the camp, there are about 520-something camps, IDP camps in Mogadishu, when I visited Mogadishu, 75% of those women had been abandoned by their husbands. They're living a destitute life. So when you talk to a victim of rape, the one thing she will need is how does she pick up the pieces of her life and move on? Because she has no means to be able to take care of herself. So the issue of reparation, and livelihood support is extremely important for victims of sexual violence. The last but not the least is dealing with the stigma associated with rape. There's so much stigma about rape that actually the stigma also kills. The rape ends, the war ends, but the stigma continues. Their families ostracize them, they abandon them, their husband don't want them. I met a woman in DRC who had, I think, 5 children before she was raped. And she was raped and then she had a child. And then the husband, the families of the husband said, so I was not even sure the 5 children were by our brother. So she was thrown out. There's so much stigma associated to rape, and part of the campaign I was trying to work on when I was in the UN was how do we transfer the stigma to the perpetrator instead of the victim. And so that's why a lot of the times the victim prefer to die in silence than come out and accept that they have been raped. And because you also have the culture of silence and denial, there's so much pressure on the victim. When I went I remember I had to go to NATO to talk to how we could collaborate in Brussels. And one of the Assistant Secretary General of NATO said to me there was a woman in Croatia who had been raped during the Bosnian War, so she had a child. And of course, you have a lot of those cases in Bosnia and Croatia. And this child grew up, and everybody in the society knew that the child was born out of rape. And people started talking. And then the son who she had before the incident, one day had the story and came to the mother and said, what is this I'm hearing? And the mother said, what is it? Is it true that my brother was born out of rape? The mother said, no. And the son said, thank God, because I will have killed him. So the stigma is not only on the victim, the stigma is on the family. They also carry the stigma in the community. So a lot of the time, we have to be able to destigmatize the sexual violence in conflict and to be able to bring these women into society, to accept them, to talk about the rape, and to get the community to understand that she was a victim. Because a lot of time, people believe that as a woman, she caused the rape. So this, for me, on a quick stop, I can answer question elaborate because it's here 3 minutes. They are the most critical things, for a victim that we have to look at it. And this is why in the case of the justice, it's very important to ensure that the transitional justice process works, and the victims know. And I saw what he did in Sierra Leone. Once the victim realized the person is punished, they're prepared to talk and cooperate. I saw it in the DRC where we supported local courts and everything. The victims were prepared. It's a sign of relief that at long last, this demon is taken out of my society. He doesn't have power over me. Because as long as they continue with the Yazidis, one of the girls I worked with, I followed them in Germany when they were They were sent to Germany. And once she saw the perpetrator in Germany, she decided to go back to the refugee camp in Iraq. She couldn't, no matter the assurance we gave her, she couldn't stay in Germany. That's how powerful, because she realized this man is free. He can do anything to me. If he can do it to me in Iraq, and now I see him in Germany driving in a car, then he can do, and he recognizes her. So for every victim is how you can capture the perpetrator. You can look at it gives her a sign of relief that something is being done, and at least I am free, because she's hostage to that victim. Every time she sees her face, she hears his voice, she knows that this one, I'm not free, I'm not safe. Thank you.
Thank you. And that idea of survivor's guilt, right? That I caused it even, that I was responsible. You heard that from Mohamedou as well, right? So Catherine, what about your experience with what do victims need? What do they want?
Yeah, so thank you, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'm going to focus on the victims like Mohamedou of the US Rendition Detention Interrogation Program, otherwise really known as a torture program. And just to say for those who weren't at the award ceremony last night, the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture is investigating the role of North Carolina in that program. And we're very lucky that David Crane is one of our commissioners. And we have been able, through research from the Rendition Project, to trace 49 detainees, at least 49 detainees, who were rendered using North Carolina facilities. And Mohamedou is one of those detainees. What's remarkable to me is just hearing Zainab's explanation of what the victims in mass atrocity situations overseas want, because it parallels remarkably with those victims of the RDI program. Firstly, I should just say that we don't know all the victims of the program. The US government has only admitted in the Senate Intelligence Report on Torture 119 that were transferred to CIA black sites like Mohamedou. But there were many more, perhaps hundreds, perhaps thousands, who were transferred to foreign governments. And those victims we don't often have the name of, we don't know. We don't know them. So the sample that I will give is pretty small because, of course, there's also other victims that don't want to talk. They don't want to talk about what happened to them for fear of reprisal. They just want to try and forget. One of the key items that stands out and did for you is this issue of apology and acknowledgement, and obviously that was mentioned by Mohamedou as well. That sense of healing and dignity that comes from a simple apology from the perpetrators. One victim of the RDI program, Mohammed Bashmila, spent 19 months in a CIA black site and tried to commit suicide numerous times. And he asked his lawyers in 2014, when the Senate Intelligence Report on Torture, the executive summary was released, well, does this mean I'll get an apology now? Because it's there in black and white, this happened to me, this was real. Well, he hasn't received apology, as have none of the victims, at least from the US government. And sadly, he died this year in Yemen, and his widow still seeks truth, admission of wrongdoing, and apology. Another victim of the program, Abu Al-Qasim Britell, spoke about his desire for an apology. The wrong has been done, sadly. What I can ask now is for some form of reparation so I can have a fresh start and try to forget. I want an apology. It's only fair to say someone's done something wrong that they must apologize. So this stands out strongly among the victims that we speak to. This year, 2 of the victims of the 49 North Carolina connected detainees did receive an apology from the UK government, 2 Libyans, Fatima Bouchar and Abdel Hakim Belhaj. They said throughout their legal proceedings that they would not drop them until they got an apology from the UK government. That was more important to them even than the reparations and the compensation they were seeking. Another area that's been very elusive for victims of the RDI program, as we heard, is this issue of legal remedy. The US courts have stymied any attempts to get legal remedy for victims. The government has always cited the state secrets doctrine. So really they've had very little recourse. There was one change to that last year. You may have heard two CIA psychologists, Doctors Mitchell and Jessen. The case went further than any case has. These were two psychologists who helped design the RDI program, the learned helpless techniques that the detainees were subject to. And that, just before that went to trial, they reached a confidential settlement with the three detainees. And that included the statement that came with the confidential agreement, included acknowledgement from the doctors that they designed the program, that the methods were coercive, and that it was regrettable that the detainees had suffered the abuse. One of those detainees actually died as a result of his treatment. So that's about what we've got in the US courts. There have been trials in Italy where we've seen Americans convicted in absentia, and in the European Court of Human Rights that's required other countries that were involved in the RDI program to pay compensation. So again, on the issue of compensation, nothing from the US, but the UK had 17 British citizens who were rounded up as part of the RDI program. The UK government put aside £20 million, which has been given out to victims. As I mentioned, those two Libyans received some money from the British government, and Canada has apologized. There was one of the most infamous cases of rendition, Mahar Ara, who was traveling back from Syria through New York's JFK, was picked up and tortured. The Canadian government admitted wrongdoing and paid reparations to Mahar. Other issues, I mean, we heard Mohamedou talk about the difficulty now that even after they're released, they are still subject to surveillance. They don't have any ability to get legal documentation. Their family are shamed. You're talking about that. As having been associated with the CIA's terrorism program, they're just forever branded terrorists. It's hard to get a job, to hold down any type of social life, to get married, to live normally. The issue of, we heard that he can't seek medical treatment. I mean, there's huge need for psychosocial services. We'll hear more from Scott about what the Centre for Victims of Torture does. But all these victims suffer hugely and need psychosocial services. Should mention that obviously the RDI program still includes 40 detainees at Guantanamo Bay. We don't hear about them so much anymore, but there are still 40 individuals. Many of whom have not been tried, none of whom have been brought to justice in Guantanamo, some of whom have been cleared for release but are still there, and they suffer even more immensely. That many are in solitary confinement. You heard that they can't get visits from family. They are in, for all intents and purposes, indefinite detention, which brings with it its own whole set of psychological difficulties, and really no meaningful psychosocial treatment is available to them. So I'll just end on a note from British detainee Bingham Mohammed. He said about what he's seeking, "I'm not asking for vengeance, only that the truth should be made known so that nobody in the future should have to endure what I did." It's very similar to what you were saying. Let's educate and speak out so that this doesn't happen to others as well. So.
Thank you so much. Any reactions to that? If not, I'm going to move on to Binta for comments. So Binta, can you tell us a little bit? You've worked at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. You've experienced, I guess you've been sort of on the receiving end of conflict like Zainab as well as on the justice building phase and the accountability phase. So are the institutions that we have, are they sufficient? What's out there, and do we need more? And do we need more at the international level? Do you think we need more at the national level? Tell us a little bit about your work and where we need to go.
Okay. The question about current institutions and processes and their adequacy to respond to the kinds of needs that Zainab and Catherine has talked about, is basically, depends on the context. You would not have a universal response, that all these institutions are adequate or not. So in order for us to really discuss this question, we need to look at the context on a case-by-case basis. I would respond to the question in the context of the armed conflict and the response to the armed conflict in Sierra Leone in the 1990s, of course. Based on what the two speakers, have said, and again, that is just a tiny fraction of victims or survivors' needs, because you have other categories of victims out there who don't get talked about. For instance, in addition to the rape and gang raping, we had a community in Sierra Leone, the Peacock Farm community. I worked with those girls. They were adolescent girls who were abducted and forced into combat, raped and gang raped, and then they ended up being bushwives and had children. Again, the stigma you're talking about, their families rejected them. After the disarmament and reintegration process, they came back to their community, but then it was like war between them and their parents, their family members, because the community looked at them as perpetrators, whereas they saw themselves as victims. So you have those kinds of victims who don't get talked about very much. But that said, let me come to the current institutions and their adequacy. A quick background, as I said, context matters. In Sierra Leone, we had an 11-year armed conflict, from 1991 to 2002. What happened? Peace process through a dynamic civil society activism led by, Zainab Bangura and others. We had a peace agreement. It culminated in a peace agreement. And the peace agreement had provision for Truth and Reconciliation Commission, no provision for a retributive justice mechanism. That was a political decision deemed necessary to give peace a chance, because the people of Sierra Leone wanted the perpetrators to pay for their crimes. What happened? The peace did not hold because the perpetrators continued to enjoy impunity. That's led to mass demonstrations, which culminated in a nationwide demonstration on May 8, 2000, that led to the death of 16 people. And the president at that time was under tremendous pressure because the recalcitrant of the rebels was blamed on the impunity that they continued to enjoy. Long story short, the president of Sierra Leone requested a special court for Sierra Leone that would prosecute the RUF, who were the rebels. But we ended up having a special court that prosecuted all factions, irrespective of on which side they fought for. But that was what the people of Sierra Leone wanted. They wanted a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as a retributive mechanism, whether it was a special court or not, but we ended up having a special court. Why is that? For some of these survivors, they just want an end to war. They just want to pray and forgive because of their faith. But for others, and I would say the majority, as the saying goes, there is no peace without justice. And I mean retributive justice, not restorative justice. So we had these two mechanisms in Sierra Leone. Their adequacy really should be measured by their performance. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the acknowledgement and apology that has been talked about, was achieved through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because perpetrators and victims or survivors, they were able to tell their stories together, ask for forgiveness, whether it was whether everybody had the opportunity, everybody that needed that had the opportunity to tell their story before the Truth Commission is a subject of another discussion. But at least we had that. So some people were given the chance to tell their story, seek apology, receive apology, and move on. The Special Court for Sierra Leone, it was created at a time, of lawlessness, massive lawlessness, breakdown of the judicial system, and lack of faith in the national justice system. So the people of Sierra Leone were perceiving the Special Court at that time from the lens of a judicial system that was corrupt, that had no credibility. But what the first prosecutor at that time, David Crane, did was extremely significant, because the first indictments were very few, 13 persons, but it included a head of state. It included the Deputy Minister of Defense. In Sierra Leone and in that region, at that time, no message could have been louder, because it sent the message from the onset that no one was above the law. The rightness and wrongness of some of those is a subject of another discussion. But at least that was needed at that time for the victims. And it was needed for confidence building in the judicial system, which I would argue contributed a lot to the success of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. But it was also needed for deterrent purposes. I know there was a debate earlier on about deterrence or not. In our context, in our setting, and according to the performance of the Special Court, we would argue that this Special Court had a deterrent effect. Of course, deterrent is not forever, it's not infinite. It is in a particular setting, during a particular time, and we would continue that academic debate. But during that time, it was extremely important. So in terms of the adequacy of the institutions, the establishment of those two were adequate, but they were also supported by national NGOs and community-based organizations who were working on reconciliation, reintegration, documentation of human rights abuses. So we got it almost right in Sierra Leone as far as that setting is concerned. Let's move now to the second part of your question. I've not taken
Maybe
5
yes.
minutes yet. Yes. Yeah. The second part of your question, in terms of satisfying the witnesses, we did it from the performance of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. There are many examples, but I would just focus on 2. Witness protection. Without witnesses, you don't have trials. And the court got it right, because we had a robust witness protection scheme. Again, using protecting the witnesses, protection and support, for instance, using pseudonyms, in-camera testimonies, also safe houses, all sorts of protection. Let me don't go on listing them. But so that kind of helped, the witnesses. It built confidence in witnesses, in the court. The other aspect, and which is the last before I give up, is outreach, engaging with the communities, engaging with the broader population, that suffered, because who is a victim, who is not a victim, again, from the affected population's perspective, it is tough to handle. So what we did, we balanced witnesses who were testifying before the court, but also the broader population who suffered as a result of the armed conflict. I rest my case, I think.
No, that's fantastic, and the whole point is to have a dialogue. And I think what you can hear is there's this national, international partnership. Every time it's successful, you have the local organizing on the ground, often people exposing themselves to great risk, like Zainab and Binta, but you also have international support. And it's really true even with the torture issue as well. So Herman, you get to speak next, and you can tell us about the ICC, because having learned many lessons, the ICC tried to do it differently, right? So tell the audience a little bit how it works and if it's working.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Well, let me first of all say that it's a great pleasure, of course, to be here this afternoon, having worked in 4 different tribunals and now seeing so many friends still in the building over here in those different tribunals and courts that I have been working with. The problem with talking after Binta has been talking is that, of course, we have been working for 3 years together as registrar and deputy registrar together, and we work so closely together that we always have the same message that we want to bring. But since you got the first voice, of course, I have a difficulty of finding a different way of not in order to say more than just repeating her. From a perspective of do institutions do enough, given the character of the crimes that we're talking about, I think we have to realize that all those courts and tribunals, and including the ICC, obviously, you can never do enough. Never do enough for victims, never do enough for witnesses, never do enough for the affected communities, given the large-scale suffering that, of course, you have been talking about, which has been the result for which tribunals have been created. So that I think is a fundamental principle that we have to start with. But then, of course, and I will try to focus primarily on victims. I think I can see also within the ICC 3 major roles for victims. The first one is victims as the owners of the process. And what I mean with that, and comes close to, of course, the issue of outreach, of listening to victims. If you organize trials and if you do not engage with victims in the role, in the suffering that they have had, in the role they want to play, in them have them participate and make them see that this justice, those trials are being organized in order for them to have a feeling of justice. You're actually missing the point. And I think what has been the frustration, when working for the different courts and when trying to, talk to states about budgets and fundraising or whatever, that many states actually did not see the point of outreach, did not see how important it was to actually engage people, the communities, the affected communities. The effectiveness of international justice and of those tribunals depends, I think, more than 50% about the quality of your outreach activities, the quality of being able to engage victims in your proceedings. I think the second part is, and that is indeed in the ICC statute that has been included in the statute itself, is the participation of victims in our proceedings. And like Fabrizio, we have been working together in the negotiations in different delegations. I was in a Dutch delegation, and we were regularly involved in the discussions about creating a role for victims and participating in the proceedings. But how little did we actually know how to actually do it? It's one thing to say it is important to get it included in the statute. It's another thing to actually realize how you have to do it. And to be perfectly honest, I think so far the ICC has been struggling with it, has developed practices, has learned from its own mistakes, but I think it's still a work in progress. There is a lot more now, and there are groups of victims that do participate in different proceedings, but I don't think that we're there yet, and I think there's need to develop more and to really make sure that victims can effectively participate. And in particular, when you talk about big groups of victims, I think one of the most important things there again is also how to engage them, how to constantly keep them informed about what's going on, and also I think from a legal perspective, how they can actually make sure that really they can select their own representative in court. I think it's a fundamental right for victims to actually choose their own counsel that represents them in the courtroom. And the last thing that is also to a certain extent quite unique within the ICC statute system is the question of reparations. Within the ICC statute system, you have also the Trust Fund for Victims, which I think is quite unique. They have a sort of double mandate. On the one hand, an assistance mandate, on the other hand, a reparations mandate. And I think to a certain extent, and also there I think it is more for the court and for the trust fund to do, is to recognize that the ICC needs a trust fund and the trust fund needs the ICC. Proceedings, investigations, prosecutions, proceedings, they take a long time. In the meantime, victims in particular, of course, have high expectations of what the court can do. And the longer it takes, the bigger the danger is that victims feel like, wait a minute, how long does it take? There is a point that people want to see results. The trust funds, certainly with their assistance mandate, while those proceedings are ongoing, and they can focus on more victims than only who can participate in the proceedings. They can actually focus on affected communities in totality. They can actually already engage with victims, already address issues, like Saina was talking about, being able to address issues of victimization, victims of sexual crimes. I've seen projects by the Trust Fund for Victims, for example, in the Eastern Congo, where they had specific projects for women who were sexually abused during the war, and where the particular programs in order to develop the capacity for women to have their own economic, own independent existence, but also programs in their own villages with mediation, with communication between men and women to sort of break through those sort of traditional feelings about what are the consequences for a woman once a woman is raped or sexually abused. And actually that led to quite some, these are small programs, but it actually led to dialogue and actually more of a recognition and inclusion of women again in their own societies. That's where the trust fund can actually assist and can bring a form of justice in addition to the judicial proceedings. But I'll stop here as well.
No, that's fantastic. And as I understand it, is it right that in the Bemba case, even with the acquittal, the Trust Fund for Victims was able to say, we can still assist the 5,000 victims?
Exactly.
So it does sort of separate out the victimization from the criminal prosecution, which is a nice innovation.
Yeah.
Scott, let's turn to you because you haven't had an opportunity to speak, and maybe you can tell us about what the center does, and also tell us if there's any particular story. We obviously heard from Mohamedou, so it's pretty hard not to top that, but are there any compelling stories that you've come across in your work as well? And maybe for each of you, if you can think, this wasn't on my list of prepared questions, but it was prompted by something Stephen Rapp said. Have you faced criticism of your work? Because as an American basically challenging U.S. government policies, or as an individual, these are controversial. Each one of you is a human rights advocate, which is, as Samantha Power said, like being the skunk at the garden party a lot of times. Yeah. So tell us about what you do and your perspective.
Sure, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for having me. I am a last-minute stand-in for our executive director, so bear with me. I'm going to try to wear his hat. I'm going to wear CBT clinicians' hats for parts of this also, and speaking to some of the questions that you've raised earlier and the panelists have spoken to. And then in my actual day-to-day work, I run CBT's policy advocacy in Washington. So I want to make a couple points about some of what Catherine raised as well with respect to where the US now stands on torture. But maybe to take a step back, so the Center for Victims of Torture works with torture survivors, refugees and asylum seekers in practice around the world. We have sites in the Middle East, in Jordan, in Africa, in Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia, and here in the US, in Minnesota, which is where our headquarters is, and now in Atlanta, Georgia. And again, an office in DC, but the DC office just does policy advocacy. Our clinicians see about 20,000 primary and secondary survivors a year, people who have suffered unimaginable pain, both physical and psychological. I want to speak to some of the questions that have been raised already from sort of the perspective of our clinicians' interactions with clients. And this is only recently, but we have more intentionally been researching and been working with clients on their role in transitional justice processes, whether that's a role they want to have, if they do want to have it, how that role can sort of best interact with the treatment plans that our clinicians are following for them. And I think there's some insights that have come from that work that I want to speak to in sort of 3 or 4 different points. I think the first is justice tends not to be the first issue on the minds of clients that our clinicians see, at least not in the broader sense that we've been talking about it here so far today. They overwhelmingly talk in terms of safety. And that makes sense. The clients in the US who will have oftentimes recently got here, know that, though not always, given their experiences with torture, subjectively have a very difficult time feeling a sense of safety. Clients that we see overseas have the same issue and often, just practically speaking, aren't safe in their circumstances. So that's the first element of the rehabilitation work as well. Conversations about justice inevitably happen. They tend to come later on as part of an ongoing kind of conversation with clinicians and treatment plan. Now, that's not to say there's not often sort of an immediate, visceral sense of anger, injustice, desire for vengeance. That's all there. Our clinicians tend to try to get survivors to hold on to that feeling and work through it and process it as that's sort of a critical piece of the rehabilitation work before it getting to the conversations about justice and potential participatory roles where that arises. The second point is that there's a very wide range of views in our experience with clients about what justice means to them. And to your question earlier, Leila, I thought I'd just give a few anecdotes that I think help sort of illustrate that range. And some of these you'll notice that sort of details are either vague or anonymized for confidentiality purposes. But we have a group of clients in one of our overseas clinics that was abducted, forced to marry military commanders, and who bore children as a result of rapes. They're now returning to villages with those children, kids whose fathers may have killed neighbors, may have killed family members. And as you can imagine, the stigma around them is intense and it's ongoing. Some community members have said to our clients, how dare you bring that child into our community? His father killed my cousin, my friend. One survivor said that she felt she might have to leave because she couldn't handle the extent of the ostracization. She said she just wanted some place she could go where she wouldn't constantly be harassed or bothered, and that for her would be justice. Another survivor said all she wants is money for her child to be able to get an education. That if she was able to do that and provide her child that would be justice for her. We have Syrian survivors in our clinic in Amman who have said they just want to know the truth. They've had family members disappeared, never again to be heard of, and they want more than anything to know the truth. We have several clients in our, also in our clinic in Jordan, who want their experiences documented very precisely, not with exaggeration. Some want their names attached to them, some don't. Some want them to be anonymous. What they want, whether their name is attached to it or not, in the long run, is for people to know what happened as a part of guaranteeing, again, some prospect of non-repetition. Now, that's just a sample. The range is wide and includes everything else that you've heard on the panel today, but I think the point is more that there are many conceptions of this among survivors, and so getting to what's right for each of them is going to be different in each circumstance. The third point is that survivors that we have encountered that have had experiences in transitional justice contexts, their experiences have varied. Some have been quite positive. witnessing or testifying can be a cathartic experience and part of the healing process, but that tends to be true when the survivor can tell a story in a way that's not about sort of shame and humiliation, right? Where the story is about dignity and virtue and reclaiming ownership and power. And that tends to be at a point in psychosocial healing where the survivor has processed those memories in a more emotionally healthy state. Those experiences can also be quite re-traumatizing. They can set the healing process back. We have seen that as well, particularly when survivors aren't able to speak in their own terms and they don't have some degree of control over the process. I think control is an issue that Hamidou spoke to that you've heard arise several times today. And that leads to the last point on sort of this set of issues. We've found that an important factor in sort of the nature and quality of survivors' experiences with transitional justice processes is the extent to which those processes are really sort of truly survivor-centered, and in particular, meaningfully integrate mental health and psychosocial services sort of from the beginning going forward. Reparations was just raised, and I wanted to give it, I think there's a good sort of example of this that I wanted to end on. There is often, or to the extent there is mental health and psychosocial support provided through transitional justice processes, it often comes at the end, which is not to say that it isn't important at that point, but it really needs to be integrated at the beginning and throughout. And to take a reparations contest as an example, our clinicians find that clients, survivors, typically describe their experiences in very broad terms in the beginning of their rehabilitation work. They often leave out highly relevant, significant events, typically those that are sort of most shameful and difficult to discuss. Research over the last 5 decades on this kind of work has consistently demonstrated that survivors have a very difficult time constructing sort of a clear, chronological, detailed narrative, even to their most sort of trusted loved ones, until they've reached a certain point of healing. This is even more true for children or other more vulnerable survivors. And in nearly every case with our clients, sort of shocking new details will emerge in the course of therapy that weren't there at the outset. So when you think about building a reparations program, right, one of the key components to that is an assessment of who's eligible and the degree to which, right, people have been victimized in one way or another, and a need to assess that. But pressing survivors to access those kind of traumatic memories when they haven't yet had the opportunity to process them and begin to heal is likely to exacerbate their suffering and their distress and actually not generate the information sort of necessary to build the program. In practice, that work probably has to be done somewhere midway through the program, which of course presents challenges for how you design the program in order for it to be able to do that. But I think this is just, I mean, these aren't challenges that can't be overcome, but I think that it's an example of the kind of challenge that we need to look at every stage of all of the processes that have been discussed today, and that will be discussed over the next day and a half, and figure out how can we integrate the mental health and psychosocial service into them such that survivors are more routinely having positive, affirming experiences with the processes, which will then also make them inevitably more effective. So I took too long for that, so I will skip the second part.
Oh, that was great. We'll come back to you. Zainab, how about we come back to you? Are there some, first of all, not everybody was there last night when you told your story, your personal story about how you got into this work. What has it been like for you working in this field, and are there any particular stories or compelling stories about victims that really speak to why you're motivated to keep doing this, or that tell us something about what we need to do?
Thank you very much.
Bring the mic a little closer. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you very much. I think first, let me talk about the issue of accessing justice. I think the international community has invested a lot of resources into the ad hoc tribunals, you know, and then the ICC, the special courts in Sierra Leone, the ICTR and the ICTY. And that has really helped a lot. Secondly, we have the International Global Legal Framework with the various resolutions at the Security Council. And I think one of the problems I always used to say when I was in the UN, I said, how do we take these resolutions and make them into solutions on the ground? Because the biggest challenge we have, which I experienced, was that actually rape in a lot of environments is not a crime, sexual violence. I found out in Abidjan, in a lot of countries, it's a crime against the moral, not a crime against the person. You know, you have that technique. So one of the things we had to do when I was working in the UN was actually the first thing we do, I had what you call the team of experts, is to look at the legal framework in a country. Do they have the law to be able to convict the people? And you will be surprised what's happened in lots of countries. And I can give you a story in Syria, which was very interesting. Once the special court was set up, the DFID started funding justice sector reform to be able to make sure that the judiciary can actually work to implement. Like I said earlier on, a lot of the cases, the judiciary had collapsed, the rule of law. And in some cases, they are very weak. In the case of Sierra Leone, it's collapsed, and in some cases, it's weak. The DFID found out that all the judges in my country were not actually very au fait with international humanitarian law. The time they qualified, human rights was not in the syllabus. And so they decided to do training for these judges. And the lawyer who had done Masters in Human Rights, Abutijan Cole, was actually, the DFID wanted it to be cheaper to them to have Abdul to, and the judges said, no way. He's our student in law school. He's like our son. How can he become our teachers? They refuse. So DFID had to actually get people from outside to come and actually help them. And so we're going through this process, and we're very shocked. We found out that our own judges actually have very little understanding of international humanitarian law. When Inga Norman was arrested, the day he was arrested, he was the minister responsible for internal security. He went to work, if I'm right, David. And poor David got this warrant. This man who is in charge of our internal security, actually, his own police officers went to his office and arrested him. It was like you threw cold water on the entire country. The news went round. Everybody packed their bags and went home, including myself. We're saying, oh my God, this is not happening to us. Because everybody thought that the Kamajos, his armed group, were going to resist, or the army, or the police, because he was a very powerful person. Nobody thought you could touch him. And he was arrested in his office by his own police. So he sent a message, like Binta was saying, nobody is above the law. And I can tell you, interestingly, even today in my country, when ministers or heads of state, people say, illiterate will say, we'll take you to the ICC. They don't even understand the limitation of the ICC, because for them, that is the only court in the law, the special court is not there anymore, that can hold leaders accountable. And I think these are some of the challenges we have. I come to the issue of the victim, on the issue of victimization. When I worked in the Middle East, one of the things I found out very amazing with the victims of rape was that birth of children cannot be registered by their mothers. So women who are raped and who have children cannot register. So in the Middle East, they found out there are a lot of stateless children. In Lebanon, I had to work with the now Secretary General, and we actually had to have a conference in Sharjah, which is one of the small Emirates the Emirate State, to talk about protection. You can't talk about protection in the Middle East. I met a woman who was raped. She had a child. She wanted to keep the child. The man was prosecuted in jail. She had to go to jail to marry him so he could give the child a name. She could register the name. And that's very, very challenging. So we have thousands of these children in the Middle East who are stateless. And they cannot be registered in Lebanon because their parents come from Syria, you know, and they don't have fathers across the Middle East. So those are some of the challenges. And then the response of community. When I walked to the Yazidi was a very isolated community, very traditional and very unique. They were trained to believe that you can only have sex with your husband. So when thousands of these Yazidi girls were abducted, they were turned into sex slaves. They committed suicide. They hanged themselves, everything. The Yazidi had to come together and realize that there had been various genocide against the Yazidis, and they looked at this as a genocide. So they wanted to see how could they keep their communities, because if all these girls were abandoned, it means globally they claim there are about 1 million Yazidis. That's what they said to me. I don't know how true it is around the world. So they had to find a way to keep the society intact. So they went inwardly and actually created a cleansing system. They brought, when these girls, because they raised money, they put everything together, they worked through the state to buy the girls back from ISIS fighters. And they had people smuggle, and they helped the girls, some of them to run away. All sorts of things were done to be able to get the girls. But when the girls came, they would take them to the temple. They will cleanse them, and they will get the girls to believe that the rape was a curse, and that the community has removed the curse from them. So the girls, and even the hospital, the doctors, we had to take them on because they started getting these girls operated on, saying that they're going to restore their virginity. We had to challenge the medical doctors in Arbil to stop that. You cannot. You're giving them false hope. But they don't know how to respond because this issue of restoration of their virginity is so important. So as the girls were committing suicide by the day. So they thought that by doing this operation, they get them on anesthesia, they wake up, and they give them a certificate to celebrate. And we met this woman who was in her 30s. The doctors thought, well, no, you're too old. You know, and she almost committed suicide because she said, oh, the young girls who have been operated on us and their virginity is restored, they cannot be done. What have I done? It became a problem. So it's such a huge problem with each of the communities you work with, the society they live, their environment, the religion. And so that's why it's very important to talk to the victim, to understand them. So when you talk about reparation, I remember when I went to the ICC and I was talking to the 15 judges. And so we were talking about this trust fund. And I said, to determine how much you give, what you give, you need to talk to the victims. You need to understand what their needs are. You need to find out what can you do. The victim in Iraq, the Yazidis, or the victims in Saudi or in the Middle East is different from the victim in the DRC. You know, they're all different. But you need to be able to talk to them. Once you listen to them, you talk to them, they know exactly what they want, and they will tell exactly what is possible. Your job is to educate them. This is not possible. This is I can. They will give you 2, 3 things. You can tell this is not possible. And then you engage with them, you understand them, and that's where you help them through the process. Because it's also part of the healing process. For them to accept themselves and stop seeing themselves as victims, they can see themselves as survivors. They can pick up the pieces of their life. They can own their children. They can love their children. I met a woman, this is the last story. I met a woman in DRC. She was raped by 5 men, and she had a baby. And when she had the baby, every time she wakes up, she sees the baby, she sees the faces of the 5 men, and she tries to strangle the baby. She tries to strangle it because every time she looks at the face of the baby, she sees the 5 men who raped her. So it was very difficult. That is where the psychosocial supports went, because I visited the hospital, different hospitals, the Il Africa Hospital and the Denis Magwege Hospital. These are different challenges, unique and special challenges, you know, with all these women, whether it's in the Middle East. But the rape is so rampant, and it's actually a tactic of war, because we see women as ambassadors of the family of the community. The way you dehumanize a man and human as a community is actually to be able to target their women. When I went to to Syria, the precondition was that I want to visit the prison. And the Syrian government didn't want me. And I insisted if I don't visit the prison, I can't go anywhere. Because these women in Jordan, in Turkey, in Lebanon have been telling me, and in all the reports they've given me, so I know all the detention facilities of Ed, where they can, and I've spoken to the Red Cross as well. So I insisted. So they took me to this interrogation, this detention facility, at the headquarters of the intelligence units. And of course they had washed these women, cleaned them, they were sitting there. So I sat down with them, and I started talking to them. None of them could talk to me. They were just, tears were just coming down their eyes. They couldn't talk. They were just crying. So I spoke to them, and I told them what had come, and everything. They just couldn't talk. So I said to them, I said, I knew they were all Muslims. So I said, after this trip, I'm going to Hajj. And one of the women said, please pray for us. Please pray for us. And this I call it a dungeon. This prison was like 3 floors down. It had no windows, no lights, nothing. And those women all were sitting there. And so when women go through that experience, I met a woman in Baghdad, in Jordan. Her husband was killed in front of her son. When I was talking to all the women in the camp, I had a meeting. This woman was just looking at me. She was just looking at me. She was not saying anything. So one of the women whispered to me, she said, her husband was killed in front of her with her son. That woman. So I went over to her, and I embraced her. I hugged her. And then she started crying. She broke down completely. Because it's like you connected with her. You understood what she was saying. I didn't ask her any question. I witnessed it in Mali. I met a girl who was raped by the Tuaregs, or the terrorists in Mali. I sat in the room, I was talking to this victim, and the men were sitting behind them. So I then realized the women were not talking because the men were in the room. So I said to the officer in charge in Timbuktu, I said, can I talk to just the women? Let's go to the room, let's talk, women talk. So meanwhile, my staff had whispered to me, that girl had been abducted, she had been raped, she was put in prison, they rape her continuously. So I moved over to her, I held her, and I said, how are you? You okay? She said, yes. I said, you look sad, you're not talking. She didn't say anything. So I embraced her, I hugged her, I said, come on, let's go and talk, woman talk. Let's go to the room. So I walked with her to the office of the staff, the head of the mission in Timbuktu. So I told her to sit near me in the couch. So she sat near me, and I gave her a glass of water. And so some of the women were talking. While they were talking, she then started talking. She just started talking. She didn't wait for them to finish. And then we sort of whispered to the other women to keep quiet. And she explained to me, she said, she told me what happened to her, how was she put in prison, how she was being raped every night. Then eventually they left her. Since that time, every time she thinks about the rape and what happened to her, she gets a blackout. She said she had to drop out of school, had a problem. As she continued talking, then I saw that she was going. And then by the time we realized what happened, she was on the floor. She blacked out. So we called the doctors. The doctors came, the UN doctors came. And then she woke up. After they tried to pick her up, she woke up. And I told the doctors, take her to the hospital. So they took her to the hospital. So I finished all the meetings in Timbuktu and went to the doctor said to me, she's so traumatized. You need to get her out of this environment. It's important. So these are just experiences, stories that have come across, and how victims react and what they want and their needs. But like I said, everybody were almost agree on the same, the psychosocial, but there's no money for it. The medical services and facilities lacking. And those are the things for victims. Thank you.
Thank you. And Herman, you had a story you wanted to share. We have a few more minutes for the panel, and then we'll open it up to questions. So if there's something specific that you're thinking of, go ahead. But you had a story you wanted to share, and I think Binta, you did as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, Laila. And actually, it's a different version of what you were saying, Sana, but it's indeed about communication with the victims of crimes and going back to where the crimes have been committed. And I just wanted to share this one story that I had when I was working at the ICC. When the Ongwen trial was about to get started, Normally as a registrar, you sit the first day, you sit in the courtroom and, you know, you listen to the opening statements of the prosecution. And this time I actually agreed with the presiding judge to say, you know what, I'm not going to sit in the courtroom, I'm actually going to be in northern Uganda where the crimes for which Mr. Ongwen is considered to be responsible, to go over there and actually organize outreach events, talk to local community leaders, etc. And it's indeed the same thing with different variants about actually going back to what the sources and the area where the crimes have actually been committed. And the field office that we had over there had organized a big program, and for 2 days we actually sat down with every single sort of local community leader, religious leader, traditional leaders, civil society organizations, and we had this 1 day long discussion about what justice means. Because of course the court is often, and international tribunals often, you know, criticized for, you know, this Western form of justice. So we had this incredibly interesting discussion about what does justice mean actually for people. And the interesting thing after that 1 day of discussions actually was, you know what, there is not that much of a difference between what traditional justice means or what we consider as being justice that we lay down in the ICC statute or the statutes of the other tribunals. It is all about the very same basic concepts. Of course, you may use different words, but by the end of the day, it all comes down to the very same basic concept. It is about recognition, indeed, for victims as one of the most important aspects of that. And the next day, we actually went to one of the places where Mr. Ongwen was supposed to have committed crimes, and that in the meantime was a completely abandoned area. There was no one living there anymore. But we put up a couple of tents on television screens, and we're basically broadcasting the opening statements by the prosecution, and we informed the judges in advance, so they were aware that when that opening was taking place, that we were broadcasting this to what turned out to be thousands of people from the area. And we were at 7 different places where we organized that, and only in the place where I was, there was at least over 5,000–6,000 people that were actually coming over. And we organized also not only the broadcasting, but also an interpretation in the local language over there, so that they actually could understand in their own Acholi language what was being said by the prosecutor back in The Hague. And it was such a powerful event. And I must say, the stupid me, I didn't bring my sunglasses and all my rest of the team had, because we were all sort of, you know, so overtaken by emotions about the enormous impact that it had by so many thousands of people coming over. I was giving a bit of an introductory speech and all that, but it was just so incredibly overwhelming. And at one point, there was one woman came into one of my assistants and said, you know what, I'm really sorry, but I have to go. And she said, well, why is that? Well, she was about, at that very moment, delivering a baby, but she wanted to stay there in order to see the thing going on before she actually, but she couldn't. But it was so powerful for them. It shows how incredibly important it is to bring justice to people in the country and to the victims and the affected communities. And then, you know, whatever your definition of justice is, it doesn't make that much difference. I think that was the story I wanted to share with you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And she could watch the live stream after, right?
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
like this is live stream. Binta, maybe you want to say a couple words, and then Catherine and Scott, if you have some last thoughts, and then we'll turn to the audience quickly. Yeah.
Okay. What I basically want to say
And bring
is
the mic a little closer.
What I basically want to say is to underscore the importance of what Herman and Zainab have been saying by saying really the success of transitional justice mechanism depends on the strength of its outreach program. And that said, my story relates to the need, the compelling need to have outreach, because transitional justice mechanisms are intended to assist the country move from war to peace. And if it is an exercise for the parties and the judges, then it's not worth it. In Sierra Leone, we know that. Because, again, building on civil society activism, outreach, the prosecutors' outreach, I designed the Special Court Outreach Program in a strategic way to achieve the strategic objectives of the court. Why is that important? The mandate of the court is that, the court should bring to justice those who bear the greatest responsibility. Only 13 persons were indicted. We had over 45,000 ex-combatants living in community with victims and survivors. And then when we started outreach in the early years, when I was outreach coordinator, one of the frequently asked questions was, why is it only those who bear the greatest responsibility? So we went around the country and we were explaining. The more we were explaining, the more the question was not going away. So out of frustration one night, I got up. I said, what are we saying that is not right? Why are we not able to communicate with the people? Then I realized that it was not because the people did not understand our message. It's because they did not accept the message. So long story short, that led to the organization of Victims Commemoration Conference around the country. And we brought in the architect of the agreement establishing the court, the former vice president who was Attorney General at that time, and then a representative of the United Nations Office of Legal Affairs. We brought in everybody that had to do, that was on the table, representatives of these people, to explain to the people the personal jurisdiction of the court, which was why only those who bear the greatest responsibility. And the reason why that was important, yes, the prosecutor went around the country to find out from the people who really they thought were responsible for the crimes committed. So the names that he indicted, he didn't get those wrong. No one questioned why, those were indicted. But their question and their pain and deep sense of injustice was they saw all this rank and file in their communities. For them, these are the ones who bear the greatest responsibility. So why, they could not understand. So through the outreach program, we were able to explain and link those who bear the greatest responsibility, the ones the prosecutor indicted, with the rank and file, by simply explaining. Long story short, I know time is against us.
It's a good story.
I know time is against us. But by simply trying to explain, the command responsibility, that if you didn't have Fode Sanko, if you didn't have Charles Taylor, if you didn't have the Deputy Minister of Defense, Hinga Norman, those who were running the war machinery, you would not have had this rank and file in the community. In the end, they understood, but they would have liked to see mid-level commanders indicted. They would have liked to see rank and file indicted. So the point I'm trying to make is to come back to the theme of this conference, that the justice we seek, is it the justice the people want? And the answer to that is both yes and no. So that's where I want to rest my case. Exactly. But in the end, as I say, they rallied behind the court. They accepted the limited mandate because they understood it. And we were basically trying to say, listen, we have over 45,000 ex-combatants. We have children, we have women, those who are abducted and forced into combat. If the prosecutor indicted everyone, all of us will be in the courtroom because we are all related one way or the other. And people understood that as well. So that's the end of my story.
That's a wonderful insight. Thank you for sharing that. Catherine, do you want to have a last go at sort of...
to move to questions. I think the audience has been patient.
Okay, Scott. All right. Do we have questions from the audience then? Yes. And do we have a mic, or do you want me to... Fabrizio? There's a question here, and then Fabrizio, and then Catherine.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks very much to the panel. This has been such a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate all that you had to say and wish I could talk for much longer. I'm Kathy Roberts from the Transitional Justice Clinic. I wanted to appoint myself simply to state the obvious in relation to all of this, which is that there are so many victims in the world, the majority, who are not within the jurisdiction of any international tribunal or court, that what so many people that I've come across in my work over the years want some kind of acknowledgement, some kind of recognition, as you said, some kind of justice perhaps. Maybe all of these things are missing. When you talk about the adequacy of institutions, I really think it's important that we include in this conversation at least a little bit this concept of complementarity and the idea that national courts should also be empowered, given the capacity and the capability and courage to have the political will to pursue some of these crimes in their own courts. And that, you know, we have a lot of big gaping holes in this net right now that just can't be addressed by the institutions we have. And I guess I'd like your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, and maybe we'll take 3 or 4 questions and then kind of go down the line so we can fit in more questions. Is that okay? So Fabrizio, and then Catherine, and then Enid, and then anybody in the back? And then one more. Is that all right? We'll take all the questions and you can sort of write down your...
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was a terrific panel, super stimulating, very thought-provoking, and I think that these are some of the dilemmas that frequently come to haunt us when we're dealing with investigation and prosecution in the aftermath of massive atrocities. I have two reactions. One is I think that it is true that the messages from the communities and from the victims groups, which have been often, I mean, already the ad hocs, at times you could see a bit of a reductionist approach, right? I mean, well, the Office of the Prosecutor is representing the views of the victims, whether you like it or not. We're speaking on your behalf, and we're doing what's best for you. And undoubtedly, to a large extent, I mean, that was a noble and true feeling and a true belief that actually was the engine of behind, the driving force behind both tribunals. We met when we were starting our investigation of the crimes committed by the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda back in 2006. A very different landscape with a very divided community, with the leaders of the community, a number of elements of the community saying, we want you guys out of here. We want peace, we want to end up this conflict, we want reconciliation, we don't want you. Just basically get out. Which was, you know, very sobering experience for us to try to say, okay, well, fine, we need to deal with this. We have to tackle this up front. We need to start a dialogue. We need to start a conversation with the communities because we simply can't say, okay, fine, if you don't want us, we're leaving offended. We have to keep doing our work, but we can't brush aside this perspective. And one day, one of our teams was on the field, and this is my story, was on the field, and all of a sudden, this mother with this little girl show up, unannounced. Basically, the team was interviewing other witnesses. In theory, no one knew that we were in that location at that time. So I said, okay, fine, just, why are you here? And she says, well, the mother says, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. I don't agree with what you're doing. I don't want you guys here. I think that we should have peace and we should not have international justice. But she said, pointed to her daughter, wanted me to bring her over. She wants to talk to you. And she had been an abducted girl and one of the victims of the Lord's Resistance Army. So the leaders of the communities had to accept that there was a rift between what they thought was the best for the community and what the victims wanted.
Interesting.
The leaders thought, well, we can solve this with customizing a bit our community restorative justice mechanisms, the Matu output, the yoke ritual, and the asking for forgiveness and reinsertion. And the victims were saying, that's not fit for purpose. We want real justice, different justice, we want international justice, we are in favor of this. So that changed the landscape. And then we could sit down and have a conversation with the leaders, with other members of the communities, and ultimately I think that what we're seeing now in the way the ongoing case is being followed is really a very transforming experience in many ways. The complexity remains though, and I think that this is something that is a lesson that I took away with me. Face that complexity. Don't think that you have the answer to all the questions. Admit your limitations. And that's the second reaction, which is Bint, I think, hit the nail right on its head. It's the impunity gap. Even if we're going to provide some justice, we're going to provide a measure of justice. And we are not going to spare the rape victim the ordeal of facing her rapist in the market every second day. Because we're going to focus on those most responsible, because we're going to focus on the architects of the campaign of genocide, and we're going to leave that gap. And that gap has to be dealt with, because that suffering has to be addressed somehow. A number of times, we won't be able to provide any real redress for that. But it's a failure of the project if we can't give that victim some form of redress. And the question perhaps is, what form of redress can we do? What type of supplementary projects and initiatives can be undertaken? Trust Fund for Victims mean one, but what other accountability mechanisms can be put in place? There's some experience in the DRC with the mobile rape courts, for instance. Things like that can work, but they have to be brought to the forefront, and a number of times they're not. International justice has limitations.
All right, so, Jim is allowing me a little bit of time? Yeah. Is that 10 seconds or 10 minutes? Okay. I was going to say if it was 10 seconds, it'd be fast. Catherine, over here. And this is great, right? And then we'll go down the line. Scott, we'll start with you just for some quick responses to the interjections. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. I'd like to make first a comment, if you allow me, and then I have a question for maybe Binta, based on what Zainab told us about the story of the Yazidis. My comment is really related to Mohamedou and Catherine's account of the situation of those who have been held in the black sites and went through Guantanamo. Just to tell you that it actually brought me back to my last experience as ombudsperson, when my last petitioner was actually a man who is still in Guantanamo, was going through this same terrible stories, and went to me to seek to be delisted from the ISIL and Al-Qaeda sanctions list. And this made me think that when someone is in that situation, we're not having been associated to terrorism. We've heard Mohamedou saying that he had nothing to do with that. Others have had something to do with that. That doesn't justify the treatment they went through. When one man or woman is in that situation, I think the little glimpse of hope for justice are extremely important to them. And I could see in the case that I handled how, even if myself, I was thinking, okay, if that person gets delisted in the end, what is going to change in his life? Probably nothing in reality in terms of actual rights, because of being still detained and having no access to. But in fact, I could understand from this case that it means a lot. Being heard, having a sense of some people are actually caring about my situation, my lawyer, this person that I would meet, but has been given the possibility of reviewing my situation. So we need to think of that as well in terms of the little opportunities of justice that exist. And justice can be criminal justice, transitional justice, or administrative justice in case of sanctions. That's what I wanted to share in reaction to what I heard. But then I was actually curious to know if experiences either at the Sierra Leone court or elsewhere, where one can see that the elders or the religious community can play a role in helping communities which have been victims of rape, getting reinstated in society, and maybe having less the weight of stigma and ostracization. So I was just wondering whether we could hear a little more of that. I'm a little bit self-interested in that, trying to understand how the mechanism for Syria can actually shape its victim-centered approach. And we have, as you know, a strong commitment to looking at sexual violence and gender crimes more generally. So, thank you.
Enid, and was there one more hand? All right, Enid, you have the last question, and then Scott, we'll start and just go down the line.
All right, first of all I can say is, wow. There's so many things here to think about, and I remember being in Uganda for the review conference and sitting down with some of the women from northern Uganda, I guess for about 2 hours, and listening to them and they were telling about some of the things that they were doing in terms of getting the child soldiers back into the community and all. And I listened and I encouraged and I empowered that what they were doing was great. And I really meant it. I mean, I was very impressed. And so a little bit more of that. And Zainab, I think you said a lot about that kind of thing. You know, just sitting and listening and saying, okay, you're doing a good job. But two of my questions. One, the Trust Fund for Victim. I've always been very impressed by what they've done and the process, getting into the communities, getting rid of the stigma of women who were raped coming back. And it seems to me we could take a lesson from that and do a lot more of that and incorporate it in a much larger sense. So you may want to say a little bit more about that. Then as part of the ICC coalition, and you talked about, Herman, your last example of outreach, getting into the community, actually live streaming, I think that's what it's called, of proceedings, to do more and more of that kind of thing, and somehow to encourage the state's parties that this is essential, and how to do that on a greater scale and what we can do to help that process. I feel so strongly about it, as you do, and so what can we do, and how can we broaden that within the concept, within the coalition to encourage it? Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, Scott.
Okay, so maybe a quick reaction to Fabrizio and Kathy's comment together, one to the second question, I'll leave the third for Herman and others. So the gap may be too big to address, right? Certainly from the prospect of international mechanisms, and likely even from the prospect of those combined with domestic mechanisms. So I guess my encouragement on that score, and this work is certainly happening now by a lot of the people in this room, is where we do have the mechanisms in place, where the atrocities are being addressed, right? Those mechanisms are the outgrowth of the implementation of survivors' rights to justice, to participation, to dignity. And so to make sure as much as we can that victims' experiences with those mechanisms proceed in a way that respects their rights, that empowers them, that helps them rebuild their lives so that they can help in rebuilding society as well. On the comment about, and I know your question/comment was broader than this, but it reminded me of something Catherine had said, sort of particularly after listening to Mohamedou's story again, and notwithstanding hearing it again every time I hear it, I have the same sort of visceral reaction. There's the prospects for justice for Mohamedou, even in his current situation, for other detainees who have been released from Guantanamo, and especially for those who are still there, are so bleak at this point. They have been bleak for a long time. This is not a problem unique to one political party versus the other in the United States, though they are especially bleak now, as everyone knows, under the current administration. And I think it's just worth noting, and I don't mean to be overly pessimistic about this, but to Catherine's point about the settlement in the CIA contractor case last year, that was a very important development for the victims, I think for the idea of civil remedy around any post 9/11 counterterrorism related abuses, particularly in the context of detention and interrogation, torture. But the only place we've seen those in the United States is where it's contractors. There has not been a single U.S. government official, not only who hasn't been held accountable in a civil context, but where the victim's case has made it to the merits stage. The United States has managed to create impunity around this set of crimes through a whole set of legal doctrines, ways that judges approach national security issues, never mind having, if you're a detainee in Guantanamo outside the US, having to get a lawyer and figure out how to file the case. But there is essentially no legal route for anyone who suffered post 9/11 counterterrorism abuses in the United States in the civil context to actually get a government official held accountable. And for a country that holds itself out as having one of the most sophisticated legal systems in the world, that is a real problem.
Binta? Yeah, we'll just go right down, and Jim's going to give me the high sign, so we'll be efficient.
1 minute. I agree that national institutions need to be empowered, and that ties in with your question about other accountability mechanisms. And there are ways that national institutions could be empowered. For instance, our prosecutor Brenda Hollis, has been cooperating with national institutions by assisting them in, if you want to talk to her afterwards, so that I respect Jim's 1 minute. And for other accountability mechanisms, there are many ideas about that, but I think the gacaca courts with the restorative and the punitive dimension that is really grassroots based, we should see more of that to complement the international criminal justice system. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thanks. So to Scott's point about the US having shut down the legal options and your point about failure of institutions, just want to say, well, that's why the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry exists. This is citizen-driven. That's what we can do in a moment like this when government is impotent. Citizens can do something on accountability. And just in terms of the impunity gap as well, the recommendations that the Commission will make include recommendations that citizens can do themselves to provide some measure of accountability and justice for the victims of the rendition program, because we've just seen this huge failure on the level of all governments, from the lowest level of the state to the national government in the US as well. So hopefully that's a new avenue as well of involving citizens in providing some justice.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much. I agree in the area of strength and national justice, and we had a very good experience in Guinea. It's a long story, I can't repeat it now, but if you want to discuss it, we can talk about it later. But we strengthened the Guinean national justice system. We actually were able to indict 6 people, a former head of state, the head of the Presidential Guard, the governor of Conakry. We'll still not be able to, I left the office now, and they've not succeeded to be able to actually prosecute them, the trial. The one somebody spoke about the issue of bringing religious leader on board, I tell you that's a big challenge. I mean, when I was dealing with the Middle East, I had a meeting twice with the Grand Sheikh of the Al-Azhar University. You know how powerful it is in Sunni Islam, because ISIS had a fatwa to legitimize the rape that they were raping these women. So I traveled across the Middle East, Grand Sheikh of I wasn't able to get him to write a fatwa. He agreed we were supposed to have a conference, it never worked out. I went to Baghdad. The Yazidis, I explained their story. We worked very well, we were able to get them, but we didn't have the same response with regard to the Turkmen Shiites. So I met the head of the Turkmen Shiites in Parliament. After a lot of 2 meetings, twice I traveled to Baghdad, he then confessed to me that he is prepared to do a fatwa, but it has to be sanctioned by Sistani. And unfortunately, when I visited Baghdad, Sistani was very sick. I wasn't able to see him. I had a Sunni in Baghdad prepare a fatwa. The Sunni in Arbil, the courts are Sunni. They couldn't recognize it. So I had to go to the prime minister in Arbil, the Kurdistan prime minister. He then told me the most important Sunni in that region group that I should go to are the one in Jordan. He will talk to them to just reprint. It's very complicated and complex, especially with, and the reason why we needed it, because the Middle East, the laws are based on the Sharia law, the legal system. So it's important to be able to make sure we actually work within the limits of the Sharia law. And I think that's extremely challenging for us, and those are the problems we have. We had with the issue, like I said, support. The DRC, the whole thing about sexual violence, the culture of denial and culture of silence is not only on the victims, but even heads of states, even governments, even ministers, even community I had to deal with a situation in Colombia where one of the armed leaders of one of the other armed groups beside, he was arrested. He confessed to all other atrocities. He refused to accept the sexual violence took place. So even the commanders are stigmatized that I cannot, because if I accept there is this stigma on sexual violence, I'll be seen like I'm raping women. That's the interesting thing. The communities is stigmatized. They don't want to deal with people who are sexually, who are victims of sexual. They don't want to be in the community. Families don't want to be associated with their children. So that's why they have this blanket culture of denial and culture of silence. You have to break the pieces of it to be able to support the victims and assist them. Thank you.
Thank you. Herman, you have the last word.
Yeah, very good. And then it will be extremely brief. Although normally it's the beginning of a very long statement, but I won't do that. Well, first of all, I fully agree with you. You know, there are many states, of course, which are not yet, and probably for a long time will not be state party to the ICC, but even among states parties, there's not necessarily always the case that it will go to the ICC. And let's be frank as well, to what extent are states parties willing to really put up a bill in order for the court to really be able to take up so many more cases? The ability and, more importantly, the willingness to do so is absolutely not present. And so indeed, I think for the future, what is very important is to focus more on indeed what national jurisdictions can do. And I think it requires a lot of assistance from experts, from a court, but also from outside, to actually assist states to strengthen the capacity and the resources of states to actually do so. Fabrizio, you're absolutely right. In 2006, that was such a debated and hotly debated issue, and it has taken what you experienced in 2006 and what I experienced, you know, at the end of 2015 was 9 years of hard work of court staff actually based in Uganda and in northern Uganda to actually continue to have the discussion. I think what was one of the most important aspects over there, and that goes also with your story, Binta, about your activities in Freetown and in Sierra Leone, is one of the most important breakthrough aspects was that we had staff in the court who actually came from northern Uganda with speaking the same language. And what I heard that day when I was talking to all those leaders was constantly, but you guys, you have one of our children that work with you. And that is why we believe that this can work. And that is so incredibly important. It's easy for me, for you to go to Uganda and all over the place. But it takes actually people from the region, from the country, from the villages themselves to make that link. I think that's incredibly important. The last thing, one of the frustrating aspects actually is that, and I've seen that with all the tribunals, the recognition or the willingness of states to recognize how important outreach is very limited, frankly speaking. We've seen it so many times also when fundraising for the Special Court for Sierra Leone came to New York, talked to the management committee, and then sometimes people are saying, you know what, hey, we do support you, but don't come to me and ask for money for outreach because it's not part of your mandate. It's ridiculous. It's a very sort of limited view on what justice means. And again, what I said earlier, it is so important to make sure that outreach is an integral part of your work because that determines to a large extent the effectiveness of your operations. And then the trust fund, yes, they do a fantastic work. And I think there again, it's about resources which determines the amount of work that they can put in, and there should be more for that. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, please join me in thanking our amazing panelists.
Thank goodness being the timekeeper at the Humanitarian Dialogues is not a crime against humanity. But you know, the best part of the dialogues is that the discussion doesn't end here. They're going to be around. And so we carry the discussion into the evenings. We carry the discussion. We have a reception for those at the hotel at 6 p.m. Please beam down. It'll be at the end of the dining room where we had breakfast and lunch, and we'll have a reception with drinks. And so leading up to dinner, shortly thereafter, about 6:45, we'll sit down for dinner. But please come to the reception and continue the dialogue on the porches after dinner. But at this point in time, I invite everyone, but the prosecutors, Catherine, if you'd like to stay, but the prosecutors and the students to leave. And the bus is waiting, but now it's time for the students to have a few minutes with the prosecutors and some one-on-one conversation. This is a great part of the dialogues when we have students talk to the prosecutors. And so bus should be out there. Please head back to the hotel. The rest of us will follow shortly. Thank you very much. Students, I'd like you to move down to these first 2 or 3 rows right here. Prosecutors. Has agreed to moderate the session, and so I'm going to go away.
Actually, I'm not the moderator. I'm just introducing the students, and also I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are law school students here, right? From Case Western and WashU, right? Anyone from WashU? Okay.
NYU master students.
Pardon me?
NYU master students.
Okay. I'm sorry.
And NYU.
In NYU. Sure. Okay.
Right? There we go.
And then Allegheny College students. So there's a full range of interests and experience with international institutions, international justice issues. But we wanted to thank you very much for taking the time. I know there's the reception coming, so we appreciate the time that you're spending with us. My colleague, Professor Shauna Kirshner in Political Science Department, far more knowledgeable about international justice issues than I, and so I will defer to you for moderating. You would? I thought it was open.
Awesome. Okay. So I would like to, I'll just start things out with one question, and then we'll turn things over to you guys. You can take it in whatever direction you want. So we have heard
I'm not sure she'd be able to comment without getting in trouble.
Well, it's interesting. We're in a business that's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But we're always moving forward. Right now, we're in a hiatus where, at the international level, it appears that there isn't a lot of impetus on international justice. Nations are turning inward, or the appearance that nations are turning inward. So these things come in cycles. We have been through a high time, and we're somewhat sliding into a lower plateau. But that doesn't stop us as far as seeking justice for victims of atrocity. And we continue to move forward. I always like to use the example that sometimes the victories are small, sometimes the victories aren't there, but we're still there. The huge, I think, decision back when we all started in this business a couple of decades ago is that the international community made the decision to do something. We don't do it all the time, but we decided that we will and can do something when there's a political will to do so. Because it's not really a legal decision to take on those who commit atrocities, particular heads of state or major actors, but it's a political decision by the international community, regional actors, perhaps local actors, to actually decide it's time to do X, Y, or Z. And it has been done. A good example is Charles Taylor. Just not that many years ago, he thought he would never be held accountable for the destruction of over 1 million human beings, and now he's sitting the rest of his life in a maximum security prison in England. So we use that as, I use that as a cornerstone by which, yes, it doesn't seem like we're getting everybody, not everybody's being held accountable, but we chip away because we now have made that decision in the 1990s that we are going to do something when we want to do something. So I'm optimistic. I like Steve Rapp's concept that there's some water in the glass. It is. Yeah, there is water in the glass. I don't know where that water is, but that shouldn't keep us and you from saying, we do have to do something about atrocity, and we're just not going to give up, regardless of how hard it seems or how uninterested many people are about it. We're still going to, keep up the fight.
I always ask myself, is the water drinkable when it was left in the glass to begin with?
I've heard it's Chardonnay.
Yeah. I think that it is clear that we are in a difficult moment in time. The 90s were unique in multiple ways. I think I was lucky enough to be involved in the negotiations of the Rome Statute. Also, you have other UN initiatives aimed at reducing use of firearms, anti-landmine treaties. So a number of things were basically showing a golden age of multilateralism, a belief in multilateralism as a solution to humanity's problems, a resort to international justice as a mechanism to deal with massive human rights violations. I think that the use of the Chapter 7 powers by the Security Council to create the ICTY was revolutionary at the time. The first ruling in the ICTY jurisdiction appeal saying what is prohibited for international conflict is prohibited for non-international conflict and international customers. It was revolutionary at the time. When people were even still coasting in the customary status of Common Article 3, for instance. So it was a revolutionary period. What happened with these moments of revolution is like the Prague Spring or May of '68 in Paris. And these wonderful moments that at some point finish, and then they're followed by bleaker times. And I think we are in the context of bleaker times. And the problem is not only for international criminal justice, it's a problem for all the values behind international peace, international criminal justice, international legality, rule of law, adherence, universal and unlimited respect for human rights, the idea that basic human dignity, regardless of what you have done, is not something that can be negotiated away or can be tossed away, and you can be thrown to rot in a prison cell in Jordan or wherever you have been kept. So I think that all those things that we thought were quite clear in the 90s started fading away post 9/11, and now I think that we are in a difficult period. These things come in cycles. I think that Benjamin Ferencz, who's a perennial optimist, will tell you that we say, well, look, we have that, but at the same time, look at the hashtag #MeToo movement. Look at how forceful the demand for respect for women's rights are now. Look how forceful the voice of victims of sexual violence is compared to the way it used to be, not in the 90s itself, when we were starting to really re-engineer the whole approach to sexual violence after years of failing victims of sexual violence, decades of failing victims of sexual violence. So I think that even in this sort of bleaker moment, and let's put it in perspective, we're not back in the 40s, we're not facing a World War II, it's not a war. It's a difficult moment. I think that the importance of strengthening and maintaining international criminal justice is that basically it is that stubborn, resilient remnant of the good vibes, right? This is what keeps us, reminds us that basically, you can't ethnically cleanse people, and it can be for food. How we keep it alive? Well, that's and effective. That is a challenge, right? I am absolutely sure that if today we started a poll in the Center of State Parties of how many of our state parties, our constituents, would vote to have the court today, I think that the numbers would certainly drop compared to the votes that we had back in 1990. And I'm sure that a number of our state parties are not at all enthusiastic about what we do. And on top of that, I have to pay for it. So the problem is, every year we have a discussion, they try to keep us in a leash, they don't want us to expand, they want us, every year is a struggle in terms of saying, well, this is not a useless waste of money. This is actually a valuable exercise. You should be proud to be a part of this, and you should be proud to have been a part of the creation of this mechanism, and other mechanisms as they evolve. So I think I am not pessimistic. I think that this is a phase that hopefully will go away. I think obviously nationalism is on the rise. Hopefully that will change. Relativization of human rights and universal values is also on the rise, but I think that will change. And I have a lot of faith in you guys. You're the ones that have to fix everything that this generation and my generation has not been able to fix. So I think there's a lot of my optimism goes of what you're going to do with the legacy that we leave behind in perfect assimilating. But I do believe that when I see people like you interested in what we do, when I see people like you standing up, shaken by the testimony of a Guantanamo detainee, I think there is a lot of hope there. So yeah, let's see what you do with it.
In my view, it's really a mixed bag, and it depends on what you're looking at as the mechanism that would take on crimes that are so horrific they offend everyone in the global community, and that's what international crimes are. In terms of a single court created by the Security Council, or even support for a court such as the ICC, I think there's less support for that. I'm not optimistic about that as a solution. However, I spent this last week in New York doing a fundraising trip for the residual special court for Sierra Leone. So I spoke with permanent representatives to the UN from a variety of countries. We had like 23 meetings. And that gives me some optimism in that I was surprised to learn that several of them are talking about the need in the future for hybrid courts to deal with situations the ICC cannot deal with, to deal with situations where perhaps they don't want the ICC to deal with them. So we may have some sort of truly international justice in a hybrid court. We may have other mechanisms that are created. That doesn't have to be a court like the ICC. Doesn't have to be a court like the ad hoc courts. But there are a variety of mechanisms that can be used. And of course, more and more, we need to push for states to assume their responsibility to correct wrongdoings that are either against citizens of their state, and interestingly, even if you're a state party to the ICC, if you have a perpetrator who's a national, then the ICC would have jurisdiction. If the crime is committed in a state party territory, they have jurisdiction. Very interestingly, If you're a state party and your citizen is a victim, that does not confer jurisdiction on the ICC. So there is this concept, though, called universal jurisdiction. And it is that if you're dealing with international crimes that offend all of us, every human being in the world is offended by an international crime, universal jurisdiction says, that's an apple up here any state can pluck down, and if a perpetrator, regardless of a connection to a state, goes through your territory, you can take them and you can try that crime. A lot of states are hesitant to use that theory, but it is a valid basis for jurisdiction. And some states are actively embracing it. So that's another way that states can assume their responsibility, because the primary responsibility to protect their citizens and to maintain global law and order is with each individual state, either acting alone or acting collectively. So it could very well be that for a number of years now, it will be up to the states to assume that responsibility. And people such as yourselves and other members in those states can advocate for that. Last night we saw a wonderful film about Guatemala. And it was ultimately the people of that country standing up and saying, you can't do that to us, that led to some reforms in that country. So I think it's a mixed bag. Truly international, one court dealing with it all. Even today we don't have, even with the ICC, because that's limited to states, parties, or Security Council referrals. Other mechanisms, I think there are others we've tried, there are others yet to be created. So there is the possibility of this international approach, but most importantly, let's make states live up to their responsibilities toward their own citizens and toward the global rule of law. And that may be the most effective means of stopping these massive violations of human rights that are occurring all over the globe today.
I'll just add that certainly the second, for those of us who have been part of the second wave of development of international criminal law, as Stephen Rapp said this morning, we were not really prepared to the bleak time that we're facing now. We had the impression that this was a movement, it was going in the right direction, the ICC was established, it was going to be able to deal with the most serious crimes, jurisdiction, you know, many states still had to join, but it was a good vibe at the time. And yet you face a situation as terrible as Syria, and yet we see that blockages in the Security Council mean that none of the usual avenues of international criminal justice are yet available. So one could be extremely concerned and sad and desperate. I'm not. As Brenda just said, you can see that there are ways for national jurisdiction to make use of the universal jurisdiction. Some do. I mean, for the crimes of Syria, these are our only interlocutors at the moment. And also you have a situation where, okay, we can't refer the case to the ICC. There is no willingness to, or no consensus to create an ad hoc tribunal or regional court to deal with the crime in Syria. Okay, let's not stop. Let's create a mechanism to do the preparatory work that has to be done if justice is to be done, that can support the national prosecutors at the moment and prepare cases for the future. So like most of you, I think I want to be an optimistic person, and I think that we'll just fill the glass. And it will probably be your turn then to take up the challenge and to move it forward, but I am optimistic, I think. From what we heard today and this terrific panel just before, the victims can't accept that there is no justice. So I don't think we have a choice. We just have to move it forward.
I'd like to footnote just real quickly, also during this very time period of the past 3 years, we've also had all of the first tribunals and courts finish their mandates successfully. Yeah. First it was Sierra Leone, followed by Yugoslavia, and then Rwanda. So it seems like all of a sudden all the courts disappeared, and rightfully so, because we're done. They had limited jurisdiction on specific areas. They finished their work largely successfully. And so there's an appearance that all of a sudden courts and tribunals are disappearing, and the answer is yes, but it's coming at a time when we're also having a negativity towards the international approach to seeking justice for victims. And so you kind of get that from your point of view and from just the layman's point of view, that all of a sudden this whole idea is disappearing. And it's really not. But we've had this unique situation where the courts finished their mandates all within the 3 years of each other. And then we have these challenges with the nationalistic kind of approach to the world.
And such legacy. I mean,
Sure.
we heard of the, step back and which are clearly not good signs, but I mean, overall, a legacy that we are able to build on now, and that you will be able to build on.
We've sought justice for over 7 million people in the past 25 years.
I mean, I think
that's a win for us, isn't it?
I think, however, I mean, there's one point that is true. I mean, there has been in those who make the calls as to whether a new tribunal is going to be created, a new international mechanism is going to be created. There has been a bit of tribunal fatigue on the one hand, but the problem with that is that the demand for accountability is still there, and at times it's on the rise. So now you have the Yazidi, no one is dealing with that. We don't have jurisdiction. There's no mechanism that has been created. Universal jurisdiction still remains, but there is a decreasing appetite for universal jurisdiction. It's politically complicated. A number of states don't want to do it, or they want to do it. They have limited the requirements for universal jurisdiction to be applicable, so there are few states less capable of doing that. So you have the Yazidis, you have the Rohingya. Let's see whether we can do something with that, but at the same time, when is something else going to be created? You have North Korea. There was a damning report coming from the UN demanding for either a referral to the ICC or the creation of some ad hoc system. In Central African Republic, they have created a special court, or state court is called, starting to do this work. We are supporting the work because we think that this is a great initiative, and we want the court to do a number of the cases that we won't be able to do. But so far, we are the only ones supporting the court. They're not receiving the money that they need to receive in order to get the job done. So there is a mismatch now between the demand for accountability and the available resources for accountability, plus the jurisdictional limitations of the ICC.
I think
and that has to change.
I think the optimism, though, is that when we talk about a decreased appetite, we're really talking about what political leaders of states want. But what I have seen, I was at the Yugoslav tribunal when we had one prosecutor also for the Rwanda tribunal, so I dealt with the Rwanda tribunal, and at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, is that we human beings have sort of an inherent need to have accountability for wrongs done to us, accountability in some form. And so I think that inherent need for accountability and a demand for accountability is going to overcome a lot of this political resistance, because in your country, it's going to become politically unwise for your country to continue to resist when you have such a strong civilian push for accountability. So to me, that's the hope for the future, is that people are inherently wanting accountability in some form or the other. And because I say that, I also think that this distinction that is often made between retributive justice and restorative justice is in many ways an artificial distinction, because a critical part of restorative justice is accountability for wrongs done to people. So I think they are part of the same solution. They're not distinct approaches, but rather accountability is a subset of restorative justice, because people demand accountability in some form or another. So to me, that gives me great optimism for the future.
I didn't hear the question.
The question was about whether or not you're feeling optimistic or pessimistic.
I want to apologize for being late, because this for me is the best part of it. Students. I thought this was all happening at 5 o'clock, so I was sitting around the hotel. I did.
Because you only missed 5 minutes.
My take on this is one of optimism, and I think we all have to understand that we are in this for the long game. We are in a phase now that is not where we wish to be. But if you look at what's happening from a historical
from Nuremberg, nothing really happened until 1993, when there was an ICTY created. And within a few years after that, there were people like Brenda, and Fabrizio, and myself, David. I remember meeting when David first entered the scene, scratching our heads in The Hague, trying to figure out what are the essential elements of half of the crimes we're proving in this indictment that's been charged. Because there was so much about the law that the lawyers didn't know. I was a trial lawyer. You know, the Geneva Conventions to me were like, what? We had to prove the existence of an international conflict. Why? Well, because we have to prove that the grave breaches regime applies to these crimes. There was so much law that we were clueless about, and we were trying cases from beginning to end over the course of years and months, not knowing in the end what the judges would actually decide the elements were that we had to prove, and therefore whether we had proved them.
You should have seen the fights.
And there were big fights between the IHL people, like Fabrizio,
I'm a lawyer,
and
You're tarred with that brush.
Yeah. Anyway, so we went from Nuremberg to nothing until that in the early 1990s. And now 20, 25 years later, the law is not very much in dispute. There are disagreements, and lawyers can come up with arguments on the contours of most of this. But the law is so well developed, and procedures and practices for doing these cases now are so well developed. And it's my hope that the law and the practice and all we've learned will find a way to move forward, whether those cases are being prosecuted at the ICC or in a hybrid court or in a German court. I thought that the snapshot that Ambassador Rapp gave us today about what's happening in all of these other areas was really optimistic, or it made me feel very optimistic because I wasn't aware of all of that. But certainly it's taking some time, but we're all adjusting, and we're in it for the long game. And we will be able to turn this around because the politicians come and go. But in the end, you know, the demand for accountability and justice is the thing that stays with us and has given rise to all this. And that's not.
Could I just give an example about the evolution of the law? Because, as you just heard, our first litigated case since Nuremberg was really the Tadich case. And so that was the first time that the Office of the Prosecutor and the defense were able to tell the judges, here's what we think the elements are. And we as the prosecution were very interested in what the judges thought because we had to prove our case beyond a reasonable doubt. So we filed our pretrial brief with what we thought the elements of all these offenses were, including the offenses we actually had jurisdiction over, the contextual elements, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the definitions. So we gave our written brief, the defense gave their written brief, we had oral arguments, and then we waited for the judges to tell us, as the prosecution, what we had to prove. And we waited, and we waited, and the trial was about to begin, and so we said, can we have a status conference with you? And they said, sure. So we went into the status conference, and we said, well, Your Honors, what are the elements of these offenses so we know what we have to prove? And they said, we'll tell you those elements when we deliver our judgment. But, prosecution, if we were you, we'd prove what you think the elements are, and we'd also prove what the defense thinks the elements are. So for some of our early cases, that's exactly the situation we found ourselves in. We didn't really quite know exactly how they were going to interpret what we had to prove. So not only did we have to put forward what we thought we had to prove, but we had to kind of guess how they may differ and try to prove that as well. So it was an interesting time, as you might say.
Well, looking back 25 years now, it is 25 years now, 93 and 98, we have jurisprudence. We have proven rules of procedure and evidence. And we've got now deep experience in doing this. That's huge. That just in and of itself, from the idea that we're going to hold heads of state accountable starting in 1993 all the way to here, at the end of the day, we can do this. That's really, it's difficult to do, but it's not the hard part. The hard part is getting the politicians and the diplomats to decide we're going to do it. Once they, cock the rifle, we're ready. Just give us the mandate and we're off and running because of this vast experience now that we've had over these 25 years. And that's where you're going to fit in.
Yeah, totally. But the question is, and I think we should hear your questions now, but I think the important thing is, when I was doing my law studies, if anyone had told me, when you grow up, you're going to be an international prosecutor, what is an international prosecutor? Now there is a career, but basically you have people that retire doing war crimes work.
When I was in law school, we had one course on international law called Public International Law,
Exactly.
by an old gentleman who spoke Latin most of the time, and the book was like that thick, and it was like going through, catechism. It was, no one cared. It's like, why is this important?
I realized that the common law lawyers seem to have this profound aversion to Latin. Have you realized that? But anyway, I think we should answer questions, really.
So we heard a lot this afternoon about holding those who committed torture following post 9/11, holding those people accountable. And obviously that's very hard to do given the current state of impunity for those kinds of crimes in the United States. So my question for, I guess, all of you is, do you see a future in which those individuals, those American individuals, are held accountable? And if so, what is that accountability look like?
No, not even maybe, but no, there will be no accountability for any of the acts that took place in the United States between 2002 to 2009. In fact, I've got this slide, and I used to teach at Syracuse. It showed President Charles Taylor saying, we need to just take and look at all of these situations and just move on so we can have peace. And I have also the exact same quote by President Obama doing the same thing when he decided that he's not going to go backwards and hold accountable individuals who, this is just the tip of the iceberg. He testified before the commission I was on, and he actually told the real story, and it brought the audience to tears. It was so horrific. There will be no accountability. It's a decision by the United States government that we're just going to move on. So, I just have to tell you, in my opinion, it's a considered judgment. There will be no accountability. The American people will never know really what happened.
Well, in general, I think I'm a bit more optimistic. I can't obviously say about what's going to happen in the U.S. I'm not a U.S. citizen. I trust David's instincts. I think that, the prospects of internal accountability seem to be bleak. Basically, at some point, we have thought that when the ICC was clearly considering closing the preliminary examination in Afghanistan and requesting the opening of an investigation, you could have said, well, we are going to do something about this, so just hold your guns. You don't need to do this. But that didn't happen. So clearly it is viewed as politically preferable to allow the ICC to open an investigation into at least the portion of the detention of the rendition program that is linked to the Afghanistan situation than to do something internally, which would have basically trumped the ICC's exercise of jurisdiction. Now, what's going to happen if and when we get authorization from the pretrial chamber to open the investigation in Afghanistan, and if and when the Office of the Prosecutor considers that this is a case worth prioritizing in relation to other clusters of victimization within the Afghanistan situation, is hard to predict. We know one thing: we will not get cooperation from the U.S. authorities. That much is clear. But we already have some expertise in the context of investigations against, the state's interest and against and going forward without really getting cooperation from states. There's a lot of people that may be willing to give us information. Now, what is that? What type of dynamic that is going to trigger? Difficult to predict. will happen in a situation where the U.S. criminalizes any cooperation with the ICC in the context of an Afghanistan situation, which would put anyone that wishes to testify in a hypothetical case in a situation of peril. Hopefully that won't happen, but you know, it's difficult to predict. I mean, I think that, but the possibility of some sort of international initiative, even if it gets to the point of only the issue of an international warrant of arrest that will never get executed because the US will never execute it, well, that's a form of accountability, right? At least you get some historical record, you get something there, you have some judges saying, well, there are reasonable grounds to believe that all this happened. And you get that. There is some interesting accountability light coming from the European Court of Human Rights cases. I mean, you have seen at least two, Guantanamo detainees, Abusadera, and I can't remember the name of the other one, have brought cases via human rights lawyers that have international practices or human rights NGOs that are bringing these cases forward, and that has led to very successful results in the cases against Poland and Lithuania for the cooperation in relation to the cases. So there is some accountability. I mean, there is perhaps it will never reach what we would like to see. But at times, this is what happens with justice in these type of situations. You get the accountability that you can, not the accountability that you would want to have.
I think also in the U.S. context, if there's to be any relief at all, it would be in the form of civil actions through the courts. But when you look at the kind of people that are being appointed as judges, I find that fairly bleak as well, because I think they'd be very sympathetic to the U.S. government coming in and saying you have to bar this action and national security, all of that. So I think for the time being, it's bleak. I do think internationally, however, again, going back to universal jurisdiction, or even if a citizen of a country says, I was subjected to this, and we happen to have an official traveling through that country, then I think there can be some action. You know, Pinochet found to his chagrin that if you travel outside your country, you may find yourself being held accountable for things you did in your country.
Well, you know, the interesting thing, if you do and you actually open an investigation and you begin to move towards an appropriate result, whatever that may be, you know, there are a lot of senior people in the United States government right now, including the director of the CIA who was in charge of this whole thing. She better stop traveling.
Yeah.
I mean, if I was your general counsel, I'd say, you know, I wouldn't take that vacation in, you know, on the coast of France or what have you, or just travel officially. How embarrassing would it be is, let's say she shows up in Poland, and, you know, state party, investigation going on, she is a target. I mean, she is, you know, I would love to help you prosecute her, but the point is that just the fact that the ICC would open something, it would automatically force the American people to say, wait a minute, what's going on here? And even that is better than just letting time and history go.
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing with this, and I think it's the last thing that I'm going to say, is that there seems to also be a divide between public opinion in the US and these policies of impunity, effectively. Yeah. Because then when we were surprised to see when we requested the opening of investigations, to say actually there was a majority of public opinion saying, no, there should be some form of accountability. And I think it's because you guys have deeply ingrained, and I've learned that from working with American prosecutors, like those that I have surrounded me, you have a deep sense of what's right and what's wrong. And you don't want to see wrongs remaining unaddressed, and that's almost intuitive for you. I mean, so I wasn't surprised to see that result at the end. To say, no, I think actually, yeah, they would want some accountability. Whatever that is, even if it leads to reduced sentences because people were acting under wrong instructions and they didn't understand what was happening, whatever, but you would like to see something. So it's a bit of a shame that, you know, this is also colliding against a wall of impunity. That seems to be what's happened.
And even the declassified version or summary of the Senate report, I mean, you rightly say we will never know the exact truth, but it gets you closer to the truth if you put that together with European Court of Human Rights judgment you were referring to and a few other things, you get a sense.
So thank you.
You need to yell.
I
flew for 20 hours, my ears are clogged, I won't hear that.
Okay, I don't know where the handheld mic is.
My question is about technology and how it might be used as evidence in the future, especially with the last panel's theme of how victims and civilians that go through these horrible atrocities, there's now technological developments that may allow them to capture content which proves what they're going through. I know we've all seen stuff, especially with Syria, the Arab Spring. We all remember like Coney 2012, and it all seems to go viral and then disappear. But I was wondering if, I guess for all of you, if you think that it might have an actual impact someday, even in a tribunal, if they can like have proof.
Yeah, no, it is the latest trend, right? I mean, it's, in terms of how these things. I mean, you may know that we last year we issued a warrant of arrest against one of the Libyan's national army that, contrary to its name, is not an army; it's a militia group. Al-Warfali, for summer execution of civilians in the context of Syria. And that was an investigation entirely based on cyber evidence and social media evidence. So this group had posted in Facebook the execution of the civilians, and we managed to download the stuff from Facebook and engage in the whole process of analysis of the images, of the footage, identifying the location, so doing geolocation of the different places where the crimes have occurred, identifying the actors, the people that were in the video, identifying the victims and tracking back the victims or relatives. So we did a full war crimes investigation without moving from The Hague, and it was in that sense very revolutionary. So the exploitation of what is called user content is becoming more and more relevant. There are limitations to that, obviously. I mean, I think that in some cases what's happening is that some first responders that are providing people with software, with apps that they can download and use in the mobile phones. And those apps, what they do is they put some sort of electronic seal stamp on your footage. So that gives all the metadata you need to make sure you can show a court, say, look, I mean, this was taken on this date, this location, and it can be tampered with because of this software that has been used in this particular manner.
They're using that for recording encounters with police.
Yeah, for example.
In this country.
Yeah.
But
So
also the IBA has a program, a portal that you can
Yes,
download, and
that's
it
right,
gives.
that's one of them.
And because the real issue, I think that's the future. I think we'll use it more. The real issue is what I am seeing here. Is it what it purports to be? How reliable is it? And what's the credibility of the source? And so what we see is not always accurate, because it may have been tampered with. It may have been just a partial view, and then there was something that would have been exonerating or something else that wasn't captured. So its evidentiary value is open to those kinds of challenges. But I think there'll be more of that use in the future. And in fact, Berkeley is working on a protocol for the collection, preservation, and use of open source evidence. As far back as the Rwanda genocide, we had photojournalists that were actually a distance from checkpoints. And so they were photographing, they were doing videos of people coming to a checkpoint, being stopped at the checkpoint. You could see the faces of the victims, you could see the faces, the uniforms of the people at the checkpoint. You could see them looking at the ID cards, and then you could see them taking some people over here and using machetes to kill them. So, and we had the photojournalists, so we could have them come in and talk about what they showed. So the potential for this has always been there, but even today with all these advances, it's even greater potential for that, as long as we can overcome these admissibility issues.
The Singapore, they have the converse side of the developments in technology is the developments, the rogue technology, right? So the use of fake reality, where you can basically recreate digitally a situation that never existed, and present that as, footage of, David Crane killing Doc Stringer tonight because he was late for this meeting. I actually did that digitally in my house using just basically taking the images from both of them and inserted them in a video creation. So that happens. That is on the rise also in terms of development, and it's something that we, for instance, trying to engage with Carnegie Mellon and other Berkeley and other institutions to say, okay, how can we develop systems that are going to be able to detect that type of fake evidence and weed it out?
STL.
Yeah.
The Special Tribunal for Lebanon, the case
That's
we're
right.
having
That's right.
is built on telephone intercepts, cell phone intercepts. And so it's very, very technical in terms of the stations to identify where the locations were, from one cell phone to another, being able to identify users for those cell phones. But it's very, very technical in its presentation, and virtually their entire case is built on that.
It's on the different networks, different locations. But one important development is interesting is we're having now a discussion with with Facebook and YouTube, because there's a tension between what they want to do, which is to delete these videos as soon as possible, and our interest in having those videos preserved. So we have to engage in a whole discussion with both of us. And listen, when you destroy a video of a fundamentalist group killing civilians in Mali, you are destroying evidence of a war crime case that we can put together. So please don't do it. And I said, okay, what do we do? Because obviously nobody wants to be seen as destroying evidence. So now there's a possibility of creating staging repositories where they can put some of the stuff that becomes available to us and to other mechanisms. But it's also an important conversation that had to be had, because at one point they were really deleted in mass and we were, stop!
Let's be clear, there's a practical, huge problem here. And I'll just use Syria as a context. Part of the Syrian Accountability Project, we started at the very beginning of the conflict and began gathering and building a conflict map and a crime-based matrix on verifiable incidents. We had to have at least 2 verifications before we entered it into the crime-based matrix. And all of this stuff, and it's, let me underscore, stuff coming out of Syria is in the petabytes, which is 1 million terabytes, which is 1 million megabytes. So that number is, I don't understand the number, I'm just explaining it. The point is that now, for those of us that have been in the business a long time, when we first started to investigate, we investigated and we sent investigators out and gathered the evidence. Now, this evidence is coming in. It's a needle in a haystack, because the rules of procedure and evidence have not changed. The same things that you're learning in evidence class in your particular university is the same that we're held to here. And so it gives a false sense of security. And the challenge that I had working with the UN when we began to think about the IIIM, which I call the Syrian Accountability Center, so it kind of morphed a little bit. But the point is I became concerned that the UN had a false sense that we got it. And the answer is I was working with a group of nations, because nothing else was being done in the UN about Syria over many years. We had an informal kind of group of people, 15 permanent reps and a couple of us, just talking about Syria and doing it. I just got frustrated one day, and I said, look, you have to understand, as a chief prosecutor, I can't put any of this in evidence. I can't authenticate it. I can't show its reliability. I can't show its relevance. I just got lots of great historical data. And so we're going to have to start taking, with all these NGOs gathering good and very bad evidence, and then the new wrinkle with fake evidence, which goes directly to reliability, it's going to cause us problems. So I said, the only real evidence we have that Assad has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity that we have in our possession that he can't deal with is the stuff that Caesar pulled out in the high-definition photos back in 2014. We've got the guy who took the picture. We got the guy who signed the paperwork with the photograph. We got the guy who put the magic marker on the dead body. So I can bring Caesar in, and he can say, yeah, I took that picture on that date at this particular time, and that showed this particular individual, and I'm going to get that into evidence. But there's not much more. I mean, I'm being a little bit general, but at the end of the day, so we had to have the United Nations admit that, and then start professionalizing this data, which is now what the mechanism is doing, is taking all of this and turning it into someday over time where we can be confident that we have at a minimum what we call criminal information that can be either developed into evidence, or we actually start having authenticated, relevant evidence that we can in confidence now hand to a local, regional, or international prosecutor someday.
But even then, if you get that, if you are able to develop that body of data into admissible evidence, 99% of the time, it's going to be evidence proving that a crime occurred. It's not, in all likelihood, going to be something that is going to be evidence that you can use to link that crime to the person you're prosecuting, particularly if the person you're prosecuting is a head of state or is the chief of staff of the army, someone who was far removed from the evidence of the crimes. And one thing that doesn't change in this, that's always been the case, is that proving that the crime occurred, it's not so hard. Whether you're doing it the old-fashioned way by sending an investigator out into the field, or sending the investigator into Turkey or to Jordan or elsewhere to speak to the victims, to get the witness statements, whether it's images that come, that's great. But in the end, a prosecutor is going to be on his or her feet somewhere in a courtroom, trying to articulate beyond a reasonable doubt why these horrendous things you're seeing in these images, or these horrendous things that the witnesses are telling you about happened in the camp or in the detention center, why the head of state is responsible for that. What's your evidence? What's your legal theory? And that is where the hard work is in these cases. And all the technology in the world isn't going to get you there.
So it's a curse and a help. And I don't know where this is all going, to be honest with you. We don't understand. The courts, law is always long behind technology. And the jurisprudence is not going to help us get to that gap. So, we're still looking for a needle in a haystack in some instances.
Just to add a word on examples of use of videos as evidence in cases concerning Syria, you may want to look at what Sweden has done in a number of cases. You have a recent report of Human Rights Watch that is actually showing how Germany on one hand and Sweden have been dealing with cases, and Sweden has been using extensively videos of execution, a bit like the case you described in the case of Libya. One way, totally agree with you, David, of the volumes that we are talking about, and that actually shapes the type of responses that you put in place to deal with that. So now we're thinking how to filter the volumes, how to go through the huge amounts and use maybe logarithm to actually flip through the volume and go to what will become a sizable, usable range of videos that you can use, answering the questions of admissibility that Brenda raised in terms of why did you choose this instead of this, why did you go for a short version, deduplicating, identifying. So just to give you an example, if I compare the type of resources that the ICTY put together originally in terms of IT experts and equipment in its structure and what I have to put together for the AAAM, I have a team which in half is composed of e-discovery people, technicians, and we're looking at partnership to work on how to deal with this issue of the audiovisual materials. And that's really not just an help or a classic IT support to your core activity. It's actually part of the core activity. It's really conceived as an integral part of the work in order to address that. But Doug is totally right. I mean, if you are dealing with physical perpetrators, this kind of material is going to be extremely useful. If you're dealing with other types of crime, including attacks and demonstrating that certain attacks occurred in a particular way, you of course have the linkage, which is a key aspect of all the cases. As soon as you go IHERP, you have to work not just on crime.
I think it can help you though. I mean, I agree with Doug to a point. I think that, for instance, the joint investigation done for the gunning of MH17, the Malaysia Airlines flight over Ukraine, that was a cyber investigation. It was a big investigation. It was an investigation, and it allowed to establish a link to the provenance of the missile, how it had come, and to track it all the way back to Russia, which initially the attribution was completely unclear, and there were multiple. So without that investigation, you could have even started to link it. Because at least on that one, you know where it came from, you can start doing the connection. So it can happen when no one knows which unit entered a village. Well, that can happen. You know, to have
Same with the chemical attacks events in Syria. You start with a crime base. If you look at what the OPCW-FFM has done, it's been looking at use of chemicals. Then you have to go a step further, which is mechanism to attribute responsibility to certain entity, and then you go into what we are dealing with, which is the individual criminal responsibility, and going beyond the entity, of course using different standards anyway.
So the media can help you. The media can help you with that. Yeah, the media can help you with that because for some of the forms of liability for higher level people, knowledge is important. And so if this is notorious, if there have been international, for example, UN reports that have been distributed to the leadership, then you can begin to, at least one part of the proof you can do that way. But it's typically only one part of the proof.
I'm so sorry. We are out of time, I believe. I've been asked to bring us to a close. But this has been a fantastic session, and thank you so much for your time. As always,
we spoke too much, so but we are around. So please feel free to.
Those of you still here, this is designed. Come sit with us at dinner or lunch. Or
yeah, but we're really boring, so don't do that. but if you want to ask us stuff, just basically tackle us.
Yes. Well, Fabrizio is really boring.
Yeah, particularly.
And for those of you in Case Western, I'll be around so I can answer some questions. When is it?
Wednesday.
Wednesday. I'm not.